effective. And the SpecDD takes one more step much forward on this. Communication actually is the most important factor in creating an ideal development method. So here is a SpecDD process model. A software project is indeed mainly consists of a set of development iterations. It's about creating the working software. That's the center of a process. It contains the development process, which is more like agile, where a set of product features and defects get committed as the sprint backlog. The SpecDD Agile team working on a daily basis to drive such features to become working software. They do have the daily Agile, the daily stand-up meetings, and the working software get created. However, such sprint backlog is not necessary only from the product backlog, but it could be from the requirement. It added a requirement to be a not consumable item like the product backlog, meaning the product backlog item once get consumed to become working software. They don't really stay as artifact. The requirement stays. The requirement, there are artifacts created specifically to represent the requirement. And such requirements not only are serving the purpose of committing the sprint backlog for development purpose, but they are also used to create a testing standard, the test cases living in the testing library. And therefore, you can actually create a release test plan based on the fact this working software has now contains a set of requirements already get committed and converted into the working software. Therefore, we actually can create a release test plan based on the fact there are so many test cases connected, linked with the requirement. And based on the testing plan, you can create multiple testing cycles and run the testing cycle to make sure the working software gets tested on a daily basis to test against a set of testing tasks based on the testing case testing standard defined. And the end result of the testing cycle, which is not necessarily need to be synchronized with the development iterations. And such testing effort actually contribute the fact now you have found a set of defects. And the defect gets populated into either the product backlog, and occasionally for those crazy teams, they assign a defect, let the QA team to assign them directly into a sprint backlog. Okay, so SpecDD process recognize that a development process is about committing a set of sprint backlog from the product backlog or from the requirement directly, make them committed to create the working software. During the creation of the working software, the Agile team is a fully capable team, like the Scrum process. The Agile team consists of both programmers and the joint integrated QA members and the user interface designers. But the Agile team not only convert the committed sprint backlog into working software, they are responsible to further improve the requirement. As the working software becomes available, people will recognize the fact the initial requirement is not complete, such as you see the email announcement functions I just described start to behave itself, you will see, you forget that as you send the email announcement, if you happen to be another team member, another product manager who opened another browser looking at the email announcement, you need to improve the requirement to reflect the fact that during this 30 minutes preparation data time, there will be better to add a status showing it's preparing for sending. Without the working software, how can you request a product owner or designer to be that smart, to be that detail-oriented, to cover such all the details of the features? In other words, the working software will be used, and the Spring development process, it is a process of sometime refining the requirement, sometime creating and improving the test cases as well. So we will have another, I would say, 4 or 5 hours to talk about this process. And I think this process model, I spent like 3 or 4 or 5 minutes describe this process briefly. I hope this represents a way of recognizing Scrum process is beautiful. It helps our Agile team to gain productivity, and I love it personally. But just gaining the productivity is not good enough. Innovation of a team cannot be really improved and improved and purposely built to improve a team's innovation without recognizing the business intelligence, the intelligence of deciding what function to be in the working software, what functions can be delayed, without the artifact of the requirement which stays instead of burned out. Such intelligence will be missing. Without the testing artifact, the test cases, the testing plans, and the test cycle process to reflect the fact that there are process, there are meetings, there are artifacts dedicated for QA process, how can you expect a multi-team Agile project to be done with good quality, controlled, and repeatable? So that's why I created the SpecDD method about 8 years ago. Over the years, continuously spent the effort to improve this methodology. So the same process, if you kind of can try to have a mental image of this process, mainly it's Scrum-like development process, but it's added the quality process, it's added the requirement to be above the product backlog. So from the object point of view, and I think the process model talks more focus on the people, the activities. This hybrid object model, this SpecDD hybrid object model is more like let's recognize the artifacts. Obviously, if you think about a Scrum process, it's really all lives inside the development space. But we added the requirement objects, we added the test case object, and we added the regression testing cycles, and the task representing the testing. So the product backlog and the development space is really about the same as the Scrum process. So if you think about the Scrum process to be taking the product backlog, commit them to become a sprint commitment, you're going to have multiple sprints. And inside a sprint, you're going to have story and development tasks, right? But we want to add requirement. So requirement consists of epic, consists of spec. A story, actually, in the SpecDD model, is not a requirement. It's a copy assigned to a development, meaning spec 1, once assigned, to a development, it becomes story 1. If the same spec 1 need to be assigned to a different team member to work on as an implementation assignment for the purpose of different module, for the purpose of a different platform, and the story 1 represent the implementation for iPhone, and the story 1, 2, the second copy of the story for the spec 1 representing the implementation effort for Android tablet. It's a 2 assignment of the requirement commitment. But in order to finish a story or implement the commitment of a requirement spec, you're going to create multiple development tasks to implement them. So how about the test cases? Well, those test cases are created to recognize the fact when you have a requirement, you should dynamically create test cases. That's why a test case 1, 2 representing the testing standard for a requirement feature spec 1, it can be used to create subtask for a development task to represent the testing effort needed to assure the development task gets finished with quality control. Obviously, during the development sprint, it's not only about using test cases to create QA testing subtasks. It's also about creating QA testing tasks assigned to the Agile team programmer or the Agile team QA joined QA member. I call them as QA floaters. They will also help to either create or improve test cases. Really, there should be a 2 bidirectional arrows. This line should be bidirectional. So test cases get used to create child tasks to testing the development quality of a development task. And such QA testing effort within a development sprint will enable the QA floaters and the Agile team member to improve the testing standard as well. On the regression testing side, with this testing standard, with all these requirements become working software, really you should have a separate QA testing team to create test plan and to create test cycle to test the quality of an integrated software. If you think about an Agile project with multiple Agile team, really you think about this development space is going to consist of multiple teams, each running their sprint, and the integrated working software really need to be tested by a coordinated but independent QA testing team with regression testing purpose. And then such testing effort help you to populate more of the defect in the product backlog. And obviously the product backlog are the sources as well as the requirement are the sources get used by this line and this line to show the fact within a development sprint, not only you'll be committing a set of requirement specs, you'll be committing tasks for the defects as well as the commitment. So occasionally I use a screenshot of our software to show you what is, to show you the concept introduced in the SpecDD process. In this case, I use a screenshot to represent what is a sprint backlog. So in this case, the sprint backlog representing all the stories, all the tasks belong to a sprint here, right? If you think from the previous picture, a sprint backlog represents this picture represents a sprint backlog. But if you try to see the inside, it's going to be a set of stories and tasks and possibly QA testing subtasks as well inside the sprint backlog. They are committed from the requirement and from the product backlog. Then if you see more details, then you start to see each team member has the committed stories and the tasks. So in other words, the entire sprint backlog of Sprint 1 consists of all the story and the tasks assigned to each team member. Obviously, the time spent and time remaining, time spent 4 hours, time remaining 0 hours. The time remaining of each task represent how the team members are driving them to finish the task based on the fact they estimate, oh, for this development task, it's going to be about 1 day I can finish. But then we want them to prove, we want the team member to drive themselves to finish the task within, hopefully, the time estimated as a target to accomplish it. So that's the sprint workload. Okay, so I would like to do a kind of a class topic and presentations. So I would like to use this example to ask you to do your best to create 2 or 3 PowerPoint slides just using text or boxes to illustrate if you are going to create a set of epics and specs representing the requirements and possibly, maybe even defects. How would you, using this model I just described, how would you create 2 sprints and assign such requirement as stories into Sprint 1 and Sprint 2? I would like you to create 2 sprints. I would like you to use slide number 1 to show you this is your defect backlog or product backlog. And this is your requirement that contains, say, 10 epic, and then use maybe 1 epic or 2 epic to break them down into specs, and then assign them as stories to Sprint 1 and assign them to Sprint 2 as story, and then break the story into tasks. So before I do that, I want to emphasize this picture. So this is the pictures. Basically, you will be making them to be 2 or 3 slides. And then I would like you to raise your hand, meaning that you would like to talk about, this is your understanding, how the SpecDD is trying to connect the requirement with the development sprint commitment and ignore the testing for now. As we continue the presentation, the training on the quality management later on, we will use the same example for you to add more PowerPoint slides to add the quality piece of it. So for now, I'd like to emphasize in the SpecDD, epic represent a big ideas. They are often break down into specs. Ignore the document for now. And they break down into specs, and specs represent the smaller, user-friendly, development-friendly breakdown requirement that can be assigned to development sprint. And as you assign such spec to development sprint, they become stories. And stories are broken down to development tasks, and the tasks are estimated with time remaining. So if you can include time remaining, that will be plus, because then you can talk about, how would you estimate a development task by time remaining or by points, and how would you imagine the burn down report will be created based on your 2 or 3 PowerPoint slides. So with that, I would like you to do your best to spend 10-15 minutes. Please do your best, and in 15 minutes we can resume the presentations with 1 or 2 members, each about 5 minutes to talk about this is your understanding. And based on my previous trainings, such exercise is very, very useful to achieve, to get better results. So let's start it.